speak about today was the Gnostic restoration. And so I sort of was given, nothing specific about this. Talk about the Gnostic restoration. Well, you start out by asking, what does that mean? What are we talking about when we talk about the Gnostic restoration? And the way that I've chosen to interpret this is a particular period in the reestablishment of the Gnostic Church from 1888 to 1913. So that's the chunk of time that we're talking about. A lot of what I'm going to be doing today is simply historical. And unfortunately, a lot of the history is sketchy. There are conflicting reports, there are missing information, there are people who claim to have this information but don't give a source for it. So there is a certain amount of debate about some of the historical facts that I'm going to be presenting. So please don't take these as absolute truths. The other issue is that some of the terminology gets very, very confused, especially when we're talking about organizations. Because we're dealing with a pack of organizations that change their names about every 3.5 minutes. So it's hard sometimes to keep track of which organizations we're talking about. For the most part, the organization we're going to be talking about is the Église Gnostique Universelle, the Universal Gnostic Church, or the Église Gnostique Catholique, the Catholic, or therefore Universal Gnostic Church. So you see how these can be confused. With schisms and infighting and cross-consecrations and all of the other things that we're all used to in Gnostic history, it can get somewhat Byzantine. What we're really looking at is the reestablishment of the Gnostic Church under Doinel up to Jean Bricot. That's the chunk of time. Now I am also going to talk about some of the things that follow that, especially in putting it into context for us. Why is this important for us in the AJC? So really I have 3 questions that I want to deal with. The first is, what are the historical facts? What's the historical narrative? What's the historiography? That's the first question. We're going to spend a lot of time on that. The second question is one that I've never seen taken up, and I don't have a good answer for it. Or more accurately, I have 4 good answers for this. And I'm not sure that which one of them is really going to speak to the phenomenon in the best way. But it's a simple question. What is it that's being restored? When we talk about the Gnostic restoration, when we never say, what is being restored? And there are at least 4 different things that are explicitly stated as being restored in this period by this group. And then we're going to look very, very briefly at the significance of this for the Apostolic Johannite Church. So, the main character in the early part of this story, the early part of this narrative, is Jules Doinel. And Doinel is emerging at a time when Spiritism and interest in Catholicism is running rampant in France. It is all the rage.
Catholicism as in Cathari?
As in the Cathars.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah, so an interest in the historical Cathars is very, very popular at this time. I don't know whether that's as a result of scholarly research that's being done or whether it's just part of the overall esoteric and occult revival that's taking place at the end of the 19th century. It's taking place in France, it's taking place in England, it's taking place in America. This is the same kind of fertile ground that's giving rise to people like Crowley, people like Mathers, people like Westcott. So all of this is sort of a piece. But Spiritism also is very, very important. And it's from really a Spiritist tradition that many of the initial contacts that lead up to the formation of the Église Gnostique Universelle come. So, Jules Doinel, just for historical accuracy, born in 1842, dies in 1903. He is a librarian by profession, and I think that has some impact on the way that his research goes. He's also a Freemason, so Freemasonry is part of this fertile ground as well. He founds the Église Gnostique Universelle 21st September 1890. And in this, he explicitly claims to be, and this is our first restoration, to be restoring the divine feminine to its proper place in religion. That's part of the initial claim. And he also claims that Gnosticism is the true religion behind Freemasonry. This is an important claim, because Freemasonry has always been non-denominational. It has always been non-religious. While it has always demanded a belief in the supreme being, even in France at this time, that's no longer true in the Grand Orient de France. You can be an atheist in the Freemason in the Grand Orient now. But at the time, it, like English Freemasonry, demands a belief in the supreme being. But it never tells you what that supreme being has to be. And so if you're a Jew, if you're a Christian, if you are, many Freemasons in France at the time are Roman Catholics. If you're Orthodox, if you are Protestant, if you are a Muslim, if you are a Buddhist, as long as you profess this belief in the supreme being, you can be a Freemason. But this claim is that Freemason actually does have a religious basis, a very specific religious basis. And that religious basis is Gnosticism. As a librarian, Doinel is always going to be interested in documents. And it is a document that sets off the chain of events that leads ultimately to the foundation of the Gnostic Church. And it's supposedly a Cathar charter that he finds in a library in Orleans that establishes individual Cathar churches. And this is a fairly ordinary historical document. This is not some secret document. It's still sitting in the library in Orleans. It's nothing terribly interesting. But it sparks an interest in Doinel. And it sparks a series of connections within his own mind that ultimately lead to the vision that he has in 1888 of the Aeon Jesus. And the Aeon Jesus gives him a spiritual consecration. So in his vision, which he's experiencing in a kind of spiritist trance, that's why spiritism is so important at this point, he is consecrated by the Aeon Jesus himself, and because apparently Jesus can't do it just by himself, 2 Bogomil bishops. Now, I don't know if people know about the Bogomils. So this is a Bulgarian sect, a dualist Bulgarian sect that actually is the jurisdictional authority behind the Cathar Church. Cathar bishops originally have their line of succession from Bogomil bishops. So without the Bogomils, the Cathars don't have their episcopal claim. So the Bogomils are very, very important for this consecration. If you're interested in this, if you're interested in this, I highly recommend Yuri Stoyanov's The Other God. He's a Bulgarian writer, and his prose is extremely dense in the sense that you'll read a paragraph, and he's packed more into that paragraph than most people do in a chapter of a book. So it is hard reading in the sense that there's just so much information. His knowledge of the Bogomils and the Cathars and other dualist sects is encyclopedic. So I recommend it more as a reference book than anything else. Joe,
the Bogomil bishops, are they spirited Bogomil bishops?
Yes,
Okay.
because the Bogomils have been gone for a couple hundred years now.
Okay.
And so, yes, this is in the vision. He's got the Aeon Jesus who's going to lay hands on him, and he's going to be assisted by these 2 Bogomil bishops. And this spiritual consecration is the basis for Doinel's authority. Now, I think it's very easy for us to be very dismissive of this. Oh, he had a vision and he became a bishop. You know, if one of you, comes to me and Sean and says,
Once every 1,000 years.
yes, every 1,000 years a teacher comes and is spiritually consecrated. If one of you were to come to us and say, well, I'm a bishop in the AJC now because the Aeon Jesus came to me in a vision and consecrated me, you would get peals of uproarious laughter. It's very easy to dismiss this. At the same time, Doinel takes this very, very seriously. And a lot of people around him take it very, very seriously as well. And it does seem to, if contemporary accounts are to be believed, imbue him with a certain kind of spiritual authority. So I think that while we can be skeptical, while we can be critical, while we can make the claim that this does not constitute apostolic authority in the traditional sense, I think we ought to take very, very seriously the spiritual consecration that Doinel receives. When we identify ourselves as a Gnostic church, we use that terminology, and we say that we have an inheritance from this tradition, it is Doinel's spiritual consecration that we are the inheritors of. So I think that we are well advised not to dismiss that. Our traditional Christian apostolic succession is a second line that's coming into this. It does not replace Doinel's succession. It is not meant to rectify or to reestablish his consecration from the end in Jesus. It is a supplement to that. And so even for us, when we consecrate a bishop, when we ordain a priest, part of that transmission is the spiritual consecration received from Doinel. And I think that we would be remiss in simply poo-pooing that and putting that aside as some sort of fantasy on his part.
Did Doinel eventually try to legitimize himself more by getting other lines?
Doinel never does. Doinel himself never receives apostolic succession in the traditional physical sense.
Or was it after that?
He seems to have no interest in that. When the church that follows from his work receives apostolic succession, it's sort of an additional line that's coming in. Doinel himself never receives what we would call a valid apostolic succession. So this is not a claim to apostolic succession, and he never claims that it has apostolic succession. But essentially, this is the foundation of a spiritual church on a spiritual basis, or a spiritist basis. One of the conduits through which much of the later transmissions on this spiritual basis are going to come from a well-known spiritist by the name, who's Lady Caithness. She is married to an English nobleman. She is a woman of profound wealth and leisure, and she is a very, very well-known spiritist in French circles at the time. And she assists, while she's not involved in the original transmission, she assists Doinel in receiving successive transmissions. She really is just as rich as all get out, and so it makes things very easy for him. They are conducting a seance, and when we're talking about spiritism, that's really what we're talking about. We're talking about Ouija boards and seances. They're conducting a seance, and during this seance, they supposedly contact Sophia Achamoth. Now, Sophia Achamoth is the spiritual Sophia that is she is the embodiment of wisdom in the truest sense. This is a language that's drawn from Valentinian Gnosticism, so we're gonna talk about the Valentinian structure in a little bit, because much of the language that he's going to be using is going to be taken from Valentinian Gnosticism. And Sophia Achamoth, instructs him. And this language is going to sound very, very familiar. She says to him, "The one has brought forth the one, then one, and the three are but one, the Father, the Word, and the Thought. Establish my Gnostic church. The demiurge will be powerless against it. Receive the Paraclete." And that pronouncement is really what sets him in motion. Her claim is that he has to establish her Gnostic church, a Gnostic church of wisdom. And in using this, he will be fighting against the demiurge. This is then given authority by what he calls the Holy Synod, the Very High Synod of Bishops of the Paraclete, which includes 40 Cathar bishops. handy to have 40 Cathar bishops just sitting around, especially since the Cathars haven't been around for several hundred years at this point. Again, this is a spiritual connection. What's interesting about this, and we can of course argue this away quite easily if we want to, is that the names of the Cathar bishops that he supposedly receives this transmission from, this authority to work a church, as opposed to simply receiving a spiritual transmission, turn out to be historical personages. They're all confirmed. You can go and find the documentation and find that these people that he saw in this vision, in this trance state, were in fact legitimate Cathar bishops. Now, could he have done his research in advance and learned the names of these Cathar bishops and then recited them when he was having his vision? Of course. And I think that there's always this possibility that we're dealing with someone who, if not an outright fraud, is at least pulling some strings to make his position seem stronger. My take on this is that to simply dismiss Doinel as a fraud is, I think, is unfair. He is a sincere, spiritual human being. He has a sincere interest in seeing the Gnostic Church reestablished. He has a sincere interest in seeing these teachings and these ideas disseminated in contemporary France. And I think that at the very worst, we can accuse him of thinking that the ends justify the means.
So who doesn't pad his resume?
And I think that's a perfect way of putting it. It's him padding his resume. It doesn't mean he's not qualified. It doesn't mean that he oughtn't to be doing it. It doesn't mean that he's just some yokel who is going to set up a church with no authority at all. But the authority isn't one that's necessarily going to be recognized from the outside. And so he receives or creates what he needs to have in order to make his argument to other people. The names are confirmed. These are mostly Cathar bishops from the 11th century. So there's a specific period. Now he makes certain arguments about what Gnosticism is going to be in this context. And one of the first pronouncements that he makes, and this obviously is something that we're going to come back to when we're talking about the significance of this for our tradition, is that John is the only Gnostic gospel. That is an explicit statement that he makes. The fourth gospel is the Gnostic gospel. Now remember, at this time, we don't have Dr. Persson and the Nag Hammadi library. We don't have a tradition of Gnostic scripture. What we have is, for our descriptions of Gnosticism, are the good bishop Irenaeus. Always refer to him as the good bishop in much the same way that you refer to fairies as the good people, so they don't burn down your house. The good bishop Irenaeus is one of our primary sources for information about Gnosticism. So we're getting our information about ourselves from somebody who would just as soon see us become crispy critters. This is somebody who would just as soon see us wiped off the map, and he's our source of information. Now, that may seem to be a bad source of information. Looking to your enemies for a good description of what you do is an incredibly fraught kind of process. But Irenaeus is remarkably fair in his criticisms, because what he wants to do is say, look, this is who they are. I don't have to fake who they are. I don't have to set up straw men. I don't have to make things up. I don't have to weave stories. They're bad enough just as they are. All I have to do is tell the truth.
It's the same as the Catharas. The majority of what we know about them are based on the records
From the Inquisition.
From the Inquisition.
Yeah.
And, say what you will about what was being done, the fact is they were meticulous record keepers. And were relatively non-biased in their presentations, other than the fact that these guys are,
Right. But the sense, I think, in both cases, I think this is a very good point. The sense in both cases is that the truth is bad enough. I don't have to make a bunch of stuff up to make it worse. I don't have to add into it to make it stick. The truth is going to condemn them by itself.
Can you say that, he wasn't the only commentator, And do you say that just for him, or do you kind of say that for all the commentators? Because I kind of feel that maybe some of them were very...
I say that primarily for Irenaeus.
Okay.
That is a claim primarily about Irenaeus. Because certainly there are lots of people who would be perfectly happy to say, well, those Gnostics claim to be, apocalyptic New World Order cults, for example. You may have heard that before somewhere. That they might have been perfectly willing to make things up. We know in the trials of the Templars, for example, lots of the charges are trumped up. Oh, they do this. Oh, they do this. Oh, they worship the head of John the Baptist. Oh, they do all these sorts of other things in order to make it as bad as possible. Make sure that there's no question that these guys are bad dudes.
Because I think the claim of the Ebionites is probably the worst.
Right.
Okay.
Now, when Irenaeus is talking about what we've called Sethian Gnosticism or Valentinian Gnosticism, he seems to have done his homework. He seems to have done his research. And we do know that much of the information that we get from Irenaeus is later confirmed by documents that we didn't have access to for hundreds and hundreds of years. So I think that we oughtn't to dismiss Irenaeus as a source. So Doinel is not building a foundation for his church on fraudulent grounds. So we don't have, as I said, the Nag Hammadi. We don't have the Bruce Codex. We don't have, well, it's been found at this point. It hasn't been published. But the claims that Doinel makes for the Gnostic character of the fourth gospel, these are not new claims. This is there's always been a sense that the Gospel of John is qualitatively different from the Synoptic Gospels. There's something fundamentally different going on in that fourth gospel. And so there's a certain logic in Doinel picking up on the fourth gospel as the Gnostic gospel. Now the question of whether or not he has knowledge of what Fabri Palapra was doing about 60, 70 years before, and the importance that the John Gospel had for Fabri Palapra, I don't know. Is this coming from the importance of St. John for Freemasonry? I think that that's obviously part of it. But he does declare the Gospel of John to be the Gnostic Gospel. In that sense, and perhaps only in this sense, I think we can make the claim that the character of this Gnostic church, the EGC, is Johannite. It is a Johannite church in that sense of the word. The Cathar bishops consecrate him as Valentine II. Now the choice of words here, or the choice of titles here rather, is telling. By claiming the name Valentine, and by designating himself as the second, he's obviously gesturing back to Valentinus. So there is certainly going to be an inheritance from Valentinian Gnosticism. And in fact, he explicitly claims that his church will be a restoration of Valentinian Gnosticism. So now we've got at least two things that are being restored in this Gnostic restoration. We've got the restoration of the divine feminine to its proper place in religion, and we have a restoration of Valentinian Gnosticism. As a result of this claim, the restoration of Valentinian Gnosticism, we date the era of Gnosis restored, is the dating terminology that is used in the Doinel Church, from 1890, which is the foundation of the formal church. Now, before we get into that, I think it's worth looking a little bit at Valentinian Gnosticism and what this means in context here. Because Valentinian Gnosticism is somewhat different from the Sethian Gnosticism that we've been looking at earlier today. In some sense, there are obvious similarities, and there are obvious confluences. The primary structure, hierarchical or cosmogonical structure, of Valentinian Gnosticism works like this. The first set is called the Ogdoad. And the Ogdoad emerges from a single principle known simply as buthos, depth or profundity. From this emerges enoia, idea, or sige, silence. So immediately we can see certain parallels to Sethian Gnosticism. We hear of the protenoia, for example. So this idea. So this is our first, we have our first principle, which is the depth or profundity, from which emerges the idea, enoia. From these two, then, emerge nous, mind, and aletheia, truth. From those two come logos, word, and zoe, life. And from these two come anthropos, man, and ecclesia, church. So there's our first Ogdoad. Depth, silence. Mind, truth. Word, life, man, church. There's our first section. Now, our second level is going to be a decad. So we have 8 principles and 10 principles. And these are, I won't bore you with the Greek terms, they're the deep and the commingling, the undecaying and union, the self-existent and pleasure, hedone. That one's interesting. That one always I find fascinating. Hedone is part of that second set there. So pleasure's fairly high up there. The movable, or the immovable, akinetos, and blending. The only begotten, the monogenes, and happiness. So there's our second set. So we've got 8, we've got 10. So we've got the first set and the second set. Not from that second set, but from the first set also proceeds a dodecad, 12. The parakletos, the helper or comforter, and faith. The paternal and hope. The maternal and love. Praise and intelligence. Ecclesiastical, not the ecclesia, but ecclesiastical, and happiness. They're makriotes, that which makes one happy as opposed to happiness itself. Deletos, the willed or longed for, and finally, Sophia. So a couple of parallels with Sethian Gnosticism. Obviously, Sophia, right there at the bottom. She is the lowest of this structure. But there is also, and I'm sorry that Father Scott has just walked out here, a threefold structure. Strangely enough. So we have our Ogdoad, our Decad, our Dodecad. So there is a Trinitarian structure to this. We'll see some of this Trinitarian structure being played out in the way that Doinel chooses to establish his church. And much of Doinel's language comes directly from this system. And I think that it's important to take seriously the idea that the restoration is a very specific kind of restoration in this sense. That it is a restoration of the divine feminine, particularly in the person of Sophia, the lowest of these aeons, but also a restoration of the system as such. The eons and the idea of Sophia Achamoth, which is the lowest wisdom, is an inherent and important part of what Doinel is doing. The 3-part distinction of the Ogdoad, the Decad, the Dodecad, also becomes played out in the pneumatic, psychic, and helix. That structure, that tripart distinction, is part and parcel of Valentinian Gnosticism. This is going to become part of the structure of his church, that it's going to have this tripartite structure. Now this tripartite structure, though, is also seen in Catharism. And so one of the claims that's made for the Gnostic character of Catharism is that it has this tripartite structure of the perfect, it's the perfect, the listeners and the hearers, I think. Somebody may need to double check that for me. So you again have a triple structure where you've got those who are spiritual, those who are psychic or mental, and those who are physical or material. All of this is coming to Doinel from spiritual transmission. It's trance states, it's seances, it's almost divinatory or prophetic. There's no established organization that's going to give rise to Doinel's church at this point. This is something that he is going to get, it is going to emerge fully armed from the head of Jules Doinel. And I think that this is one of the few cases where we see the emergence of an organization from whole cloth in this way. Even when we look at, for example, the emergence of the Jesus communities in Palestine in the first century of the Common Era. They're coming from organizations. They're drawing on other kinds of bodies. They're drawing on other systems of structure. When we look at the emergence of the Roman Church, I mean, it adopts the structure, the style of dress, much of the ceremonial of imperial Rome. But here we're seeing something that seems to be really self-generated in a way. It really seems to be coming from Doinel's mind in a real sense of the word. How are we doing on time? You look like there was a clock.
I'm looking at the time on the thing.
He's looking at the camera.
Oh, he's looking at the camera. I'm confused. I'm looking
He's
back.
having a vision of a clock.
Yeah, he's having a vision. What time do we have?
It says we
it's a
have
cathode
30
acolyte
minutes
with a
or
big
so.
clock.
Right.
I sense we have 30 minutes or so.
Okay, so we're about 30 minutes in. I only ask because we've come to a sort of natural stopping point, because it's at this point that the really dry and deadly part of this presentation starts, which is so-and-so begat so-and-so, and so-and-so begat so-and-so, and so-and-so. And here it's not births, but the lineal consecrations, and the point-by-point history of the church. And we're still going to get into the structure and the sacraments and the theology of these churches, but much of our understanding has to be rooted in simply the history of the personalities involved. And as is so often the case with any organization with strong personalities involved, you've got to know the characters, you've got to know the players.
Getting past who begat who,
Yeah.
and or who begat whom, as the case may be, and you know the transmission and stuff like that. And perhaps you're going to cover this a little later. Forgive me if I'm jumping forward. Just how big was his church?
You know what? It's a really, really good question. Because Doinel's church is no different from 1,000 little churches on the internet today.
Yeah, and see, this is the thing. You hear a lot about it, but I've never ever seen any real references in terms of just, you know, what were we dealing with as an organization? Was it a guy in his home church? Or was it much like we draw the parallel today? Well, relatively, you know, there were branch outposts, but they were small congregations. Or is this sort of a successful organization that, you know, despite later problems, you know, enjoy a certain amount of definite prevalence?
Yeah.
Size is not a measure of influence.
No, it is not. But I think it is an important piece of historical data.
Yeah. Did it go further than just the initial stages?
Now we do know that Doinel is going to establish parishes in a lot of places very quickly. Now why is this the case? Because he's the only game in town. He is this is the one point perhaps in history when we can claim that there is a Gnostic church, singular. And it's going to last all of about 3 years. You know, until there's break-offs and people start splitting away. But at this point, there is a Gnostic church.
Weren't there remnants of the Ventrasian churches or Palaprots?
At this point, not as a church. There may have been, and we are going to talk about this, there may be successor bishops to Palaprot's church. there are people who claim to have Vintres's Carmelite
Sure.
succession, but there is no church. The Vintres's church and the Holy Church of Christ, which is Falloprot's church, as organizations simply don't exist at this point. We are going to talk about those successions later on because they're going to become really, really important for Bertot. So I think the answer is that we're never totally sure. It does seem to have caught on like wildfire. It does seem to have been established in a lot of places in France very, very quickly. And why is this? Well, because Doinel's friends with everybody. You know, he's got connections through his Masonic lodges. He's got connections through Lady Caithness. You know, he's got lots of people who want to participate in this. Again, because it's the new thing. It's the one thing that there is. And so everybody who has had an interest in this, everybody who has been doing things like esoteric Freemasonry, everybody who's had an interest in things like Martinism, everybody who's had an interest in Catholicism, everybody who's had an interest in Gnosticism, all of a sudden goes, we've got this opportunity, let's hook up with this guy. And while it would be unfair to call him a bishop mill, because he seems to have really good people surrounding him, he does perform a lot of consecrations very, very quickly. Now, whenever you're getting an organization going, it's sometimes necessary to fast-track people, to move them through quickly so that you can get things going. And then you reach a kind of critical mass, at which point you say, okay, stop, and now we're going to do things on this very precise sort of basis. We see this real clearly in the OTO after Crowley, for example. When Grady McMurtry, and this is a real digression, but I think it's an appropriate sort of metaphor. When Grady McMurtry activates his charter, he's given out 5th degrees OTO in bars. He's handing out really exalted positions within this organization on a kind of a slipshod basis, on a scattershot basis. Well, is he doing that just because he's a drunk and because he doesn't know what he's doing? No, he's planting a bunch of seeds in hopes that a handful of them are going to grow. And I think that in some sense, Doinel is doing the same thing. He's gonna give a lot of hats out in hope that of those 12 hats that he gives out, 3 of those people are really going to start to build the church. And I think that this is not necessarily an unusual sort of methodology or tactic for a new organization. And this is a brand new organization and there's nothing like it. So he can't even draw from other organizations. He can't even pillage and pilfer from other organizations. He's got to start everything new. It does seem to have a certain degree of popularity. It does seem to have a certain degree of financing. There are people who get involved who have money. And it does seem to appeal to, it appeals to ideas and desires that are already very, very present in the community at the time. And that's, whenever we see a movement really take off, that's why it happens. It's never a matter of some hierarch, some prophet, some leader creating the desire for an organization. What he does is he creates or she creates something that speaks to a desire that already exists. And because of this interest in Spiritism, because of the interest in Catholicism, because of the interest in esotericism generally, as soon as he creates this organization, people flock to it because they've been looking for something like this all along. I think that in some sense this has been part of the success of the AJC over the last 10 years, is that an organization of a specifically Johannite orientation is something that people have been searching for. They've wanted to have this. And so when the organization manifested, people flocked to it. Now, are there great EGU cathedrals in Lyon and Paris? No. Were they renting spaces in basements? Were they meeting in Masonic lodges? Were they meeting in people's houses? Yeah, that's how this gets built. That said, it does seem to be active, and I mean really active, in maybe a dozen cities in France, dozen places in France within 2 years. And that's an extraordinary kind of growth. So, very long answer to a very, very simple question. We're never going to know exactly how many people were involved. We do know that it did have some degree of popularity. And as Father Anthony pointed out, even if it were smaller than, a mainstream church, it doesn't make it necessarily less important or less influential. Even small churches at this stage can have a profound influence on what comes after, simply because of things like their publishing. That they're writing articles, they're printing journals, they are publishing books, they're doing all of these things to disseminate their ideas, not having access to the internet, of course, and because of that, no matter how small they might have been, the perceived influence is going to be much, much greater. Doinel begins to consecrate a number of bishops in order to get the new church going. Of these, I'm going to give just a couple of examples. Gerard Ancose, 1865 to 1916, is consecrated as Tau Vincent. Now, we know that Papos, or Dr. Ancose, is very, very important for the restructuring of the Martinist order. He is involved he's got his fingers in everybody's pies. So this is a central figure. This is an important figure. And he is one of the first consecrations by Doinel. Paul Sedia is consecrated as Tau Paulus. His date's 1871 to 1926. Chamuel is consecrated as Tau Bardessan. So he is a lot of the people who are leading lights in esoteric Freemasonry, in Theosophy, in Spiritism. These people are the ones who are getting consecrated by Doinel. Again, I want to emphasize this. This is not an apostolic consecration. This is not a claim to a traditional Christian apostolic succession. There doesn't seem to be a kind of high Christology in the church at this point, despite its affection for John. So there is no need, in some sense, to tie it back to the traditional Christian church. Very, very quickly, that is going to change. And very, very quickly, we're going to see a very rapid sort of Latinization, a Romanization of the EGU. And at that point, a traditional apostolic succession is going to become absolutely, absolutely vital. A later consecration in 1892, like I said, this first schwack of consecrations happens really in 1890. So within a year, he's consecrated, I think, 12 individual bishops. And can you imagine the AJC consecrated 12 bishops in a year?
That's what I was hoping for.
You would think that we had absolutely lost our minds. Well, especially if we would have absolutely lost our minds. So, but in 1892, Doinel consecrates Fabre des Essarts as Tau Synesius. And Synesius is going to be a vital link in the chain that connects Doinel's church to the later churches in the 20th century. So what does this church look like? It's a good question. It really does seem to draw together three theological streams, only one of which is really vitally important for the way that ecclesiastical Gnosticism develops over the next 120 years. And that's the Valentinian stream. That has remained important even for us to this day. We still use the language of the Ogdoad. We still look at the aeons. We still talk about Sophia Achmath. We still think of the importance of the holy wisdom. We have this demiurgical language that we deploy periodically. That Valentinian Gnosticism is one of the major streams, but there are two others. The first is Simonian, is from Simon Magus, and the other is from Marcos. So we've got these three, while very, very similar Gnostic streams, nonetheless divergent, coming together, and those are all informing what Doinel is doing in his church. These three systems are not always internally consistent. They are not necessarily consistent with each other. And as a result, it does look a little like a hodgepodge. It does look a little like it's stitched together and you can see the seams. That said, I think that what's happening is Doinel is working through an incredibly sophisticated set of theological propositions and structures. Even if you were to just say, we're going to be a Valentinian church, you'd still be dealing with contradictions. You'd still be dealing with confusion about how to work out certain things. These aren't straightforward systems. These are all valiant attempts by men and women who experience the gnosis to codify, to systematize, to regularize, to taxonomize all of these various experiences. And that's not always going to work. That's not always going to be an easy task. So if we look at Doinel's church and we say, oh, well, they say this at this point, and this at this point, and there are all these contradictions, that's how Gnosticism is. And I think that that's how it is by its nature. I don't think that that's a failing. I don't think that that's a flaw. I don't think that that's a mistake that we've made or a problem that we need to fix. But instead, I think that it speaks to the complexity and the ineffability of what we're trying to work with, of our subject matter. He does institute a sacramental structure, and that he revives what he calls or restores the Cathar sacraments. And here we get our third kind of restoration, that this is a restoration of the Cathar sacraments. Stacey, do you have a question?
Well, yeah, what you're getting to now, it makes me, I tend to think of things in big pictures. Did he ever at all consider his church in any kind of connection to Christianity besides the Gospel of John and now besides you're getting sacraments?
Well, it is a... Boy, I mean, the word Christian's tough here.
I know.
We're really looking, I mean, this is where we get these interesting liminal cases. Is this a Christian church in the traditional sense of the word?
No.
Not really. Is this a church that holds the Aeon Christ, for example, the Aeon Jesus, as vitally important? Yeah. And I think we could, for example, ask the same thing of the Cathars. Now, the Cathars simply called themselves good Christians. So they certainly thought of themselves as a Christian church. The Roman Church, not so much. Didn't quite think of them in quite those ways. So I think that there is a perspectival issue. So I think that he would think of himself, boy, it's a tough question. I think that Doinel, if he were pushed, would say, yes, I am a Christian. I could be wrong there. That's not something I'm going to stake my life on. That's not a hill I'm going to die on.
Can't you really say that since Aeon Jesus is at the center of this, that by definition, Christianity is the universal church of Christ?
If we think of it in those kinds of broad terms, then, and I think that he does.
He refers to Christ as Soter, as Savior.
Yeah.
Right.
So,
right.
I mean, isn't that really the basic criteria for Christianity?
If that is our criterion, and I think that that is a meaningful criterion, absolutely. Is that necessarily the way that the word is used in even these contemporary circles or in our contemporary circles? Not so much. So I think
my question is what he actually thought himself.
he does think of Christ as Savior.
Yeah.
For me, that's enough. for me that's enough to say that he considered himself a Christian. But he really is sitting right on the border. He's sitting right on the border there. So, he claims to restore, and again, he's using this word specifically, to restore the Cathar sacraments. So now we have a third thing that he's claiming to restore in this restoration. So now we've got restoring the divine feminine, restoring Valentinian Gnosticism, and restoring the Cathar sacraments. And those are not the same thing, and those are distinctly different things. You could have a Valentinian church that's not Cathar. In fact, you'd be much more sort of internally consistent if that were the case. You can have a church that concentrates on the divine feminine without being Valentinian. You can have a church that concentrates on the divine feminine without being Cathar. So we really do have three separate things so far. Three things so far that are being restored. But this is the third one. He's going to restore the Cathar sacraments. That's an institutional structure. That is a kind of ritual practice. So here we're not talking about restoring an idea, or restoring a principle, or restoring a school of thought. Here we've come to restoring a kind of practice. Now, the practice of the three Cathar sacraments are the consolamentum, the paramentum, and the fraction, the fractionum du pain, the Eucharist. So there is still also, I mean, in terms of asking the question of Christianity, there still is a Eucharistic sacrament. We would say, oh, this is not a valid Eucharist in the sense that it is canonically valid through apostolic succession, but there is a Eucharistic celebration. He also restores the three-part structure that we mentioned above of pneumatic, psychic, and helic. And he gives an interesting read on this, and I'm not exactly sure what the source of this is, or whether this is, as we say, sort of beamed down from Saturn into Doinel's head. But the Gnostic and spiritual group, that is to say the pneumatics, are referred to as pertaining to Seth. So while there isn't a Sethian Gnostic link explicitly, we still do have this reference to Seth. So the Gnostic and spiritual group, the pneumatics, are Seth, seed of Seth. The mental and daimonic, the psychic, pertain to Abel. Now when I use this word daimonic, let me just make a very, very quick gloss on this terminology. For the Greeks, the daimons were those beings that moved between the material and the spiritual world. They were the bridges. They were the ones who went from one to the other. So, for example, if you read Plato's Symposium, this wonderful depiction of Eros, love, as a daimon. Neither wealthy nor poor, neither good nor evil, neither mortal nor immortal. They cross those paths.
Wasn't Eros the lowest brand of love in terms of more lustful?
Well, Eros,
Philos and agape?
well, I think those are very, very different things, and I don't want to get too much off in a digression because I could just end up talking about this for the rest of the time.
No, it's just in context.
They're very, very
of
different
reference,
kinds
yeah.
of things. When Plato is talking about Eros, he's using it as a much more sort of a general idea, but it still has this strong sexual component. But there is, for example, in Pausanias' speech in Symposium, the description of the heavenly love, the Uranic Aphrodite and Eros, and then Aphrodite and Eros Demos, the popular or vulgar love. So I mean, even within thinking about Eros, there are these higher and lower distinctions. But Eros is seen as a daimon, as something that moves between the spiritual and the material world. And so the mental, the psychic group is moving between, is fluctuating between the spiritual and the material. And then there are those who are the material, the hylic, those who pertain to Cain, whom he simply and delightfully refers to as the doomed. He just sort of gives out. So there are the doomed. I think we should adopt
Wouldn't you say
this.
that Abel was more doomed than...
Okay, yeah.
if you're going to go with the
But
Genesis
his
story.
but his sacrifice is not accepted,
Yeah.
and that's what's important. So we have this restoration of a Cathar structure, of a Cathar practice in terms of the divisions of clergy and laity, divisions of kinds of sacraments and who can perform certain kinds of sacraments. And so we see another kind of restoration here. We see our last kind of restoration in a series of pronouncements that were published by the Holy Gnostic Synod, by the group of Gnostic bishops. And these decrees of the Holy Gnostic Synod include a couple of key points. I won't go through all of them. But Article 1 says that the reestablishment of the hierarchy, reestablishment of an ecclesial hierarchy, and a sacramental hierarchy, and a hierarchy of clergy and laity, permits the restoration of Gnostic symbolism. Now we've got a fourth thing that's getting restored. So we've got the restoration of the divine feminine to its proper place in religion. We have the restoration of Valentinian Gnosticism. We have the restoration of Cathar practice and the restoration of Gnostic symbolism. And these are very, very different things that are all claiming to be restored in this restoration. There are other pronouncements that are made, and after we get through this, I think we'll take a break and come back. Article 7, and this is one of the first mentions of this. Article 7 says that Martinism is Gnostic in character. This is an important. Now, obviously, how does this happen? Well, this happens because Pappus has been consecrated as a Gnostic bishop. Martinism is Gnostic in character. So now we've made a double claim regarding the Gnostic character of fraternal and initiatic organizations. Both Freemasonry, Freemasonry doesn't drop out, even though they mention Martinism explicitly here. The nature of Freemasonry is still Gnostic. So Freemasonry is Gnostic. Now Martinism is also Gnostic. So we're starting to get a glimpse of the edges of this movement. What kinds of people are going to be involved in the Gnostic Church? These are people that are going to be interested in Freemasonry. There are going to be people that are going to be interested in Gnosticism, or in Martinism rather. There are people that are going to be interested in Theosophy. That's the core group that we're working with here. And in Article 8, it is reiterated that John is the only gospel of Gnosticism. So at this point, a kind of restoration, if you can call it that, has already taken place. That we have established, that Doinel has established a Gnostic church, arguably the first Gnostic church. Yeah, the Cathars were Gnostic, sure. The Manichaeans were Gnostic. The Mandeans were Gnostic. We're talking about a Gnostic church. And the use of that term, I think, is important because he is drawing on a lot of the mainstream ecclesiastical images and practices in order to solidify an organization, in order to solidify a jurisdiction. And at this time, it is the Gnostic Church. You can simply call it that.
Would it be more proper to say the first that self-identifies?
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. And we in the NACGB, we use this terminology of self-identifying as Gnostic. It is the first, it's not the first church that happens to be Gnostic.
Yeah.
It's the first Gnostic church that identifies itself as such.
So-called modern Gnostic.
So-called modern Gnostic church.
Could you use autogenesis for this?
There does seem to be a kind of autogenesis. It is created whole cloth from the transmission that Doinel gets from.
Spontaneous manifestation.
It's a spontaneous manifestation. It comes in trance. He receives a spiritual transmission, and he's off and running. Okay. Let's take a break here, and do we have a couple of minutes for any other questions?
Sure.
Okay. So are there any other questions just on this section before we take our break and move on? Okay, let's take our break, and we'll let Anthony download the materials.